I learned this from a missionary friend of mine who was a missionary in Pakistan for over 20 years. And it was so helpful. Culture gives us our identity, it tells us who we are, who we belong to, what our values are. In the West, we emphasize individualism. In the East, it's more this idea of a collectivism. You're part of a group, right? Just think of the difference between like Japanese and American culture. I think a Japanese proverb is the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And what it means is if you don't conform, if there's a row of nails and there's one higher than the others, that's the one that's going to get whacked with the hammer. And so the idea is conform, don't stand out, blend in, be part of the group. In the West, we're told, be different, think for yourself, go for it, follow your dreams, follow your passions. And I mean, we do get mixed messages in the West, right? Because out of one side of our mouth, we're pushing all the individualism, but then there is also an incredible push to get us to conform to certain things in our culture and society. And then in tribal groups, it becomes even more of that circling the wagons of this is our people, this is our group, we are the ones. And there can be a lot of xenophobia for those that are outside or other. Fear, it's a fancy word for fear of the other, xenophobia. In a power-based cultures, you'll see often find those in tribal societies where you might have one ultimate chieftain and everyone else might be beholding to him. You could see it a lot in maybe like Eastern despots or tyrants in the West or authoritarians, where you had one head, like, and then everyone else was under that person. And basically, the people with the power made the rules. That a very Machiavellian type of mentality or attitude. The person with the biggest stick wins. In a truth-based culture, which traditionally that has been the West, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Hebrews, is this idea that our society is interested in finding out the truth as it relates to reality. And we want to choose truth over falsehood. That's what our legal system's based on. That's what a lot of our rights are based on. And right now you can see our culture is really taking a beating because we're moving from a truth-based culture. Either it kind of looks to me like a power-based culture. Like the people with the power makes the rules, whether you're liberal or conservative. That's the great fear of both sides, right? Like if these people get in control, they're going to ruin the country. And the other side feels the same way. And there's this great fear, but it's not, doesn't seem to me in the courts or in Congress or politics that people are necessarily looking for the truth anymore. It's about narrative and who can get the most people to buy into their particular narrative, whether that's a political candidate, whether that's a preacher, whether that's a professor, whether that's an entertainer. And that goes back to Nietzsche, right? That was his whole trip. Everyone's trying to get you to buy into their narrative. It's not about truth and falsehood. It's not about honor and shame, but interesting. And then the last group we find much more in, you find this a lot in Middle Eastern cultures, is this honor shame. It's not just Middle Eastern, but that's where I have more examples from. And the same missionary friend, this is the story he used to explain it to me. Obviously, you have to be very careful in Pakistan. You cannot disparage the Quran or the Prophet Muhammad in Pakistan without severe consequences. I mean, a mob could beat you to death, or you could be exiled from the country. So you have to really watch what you're saying. It's not that you can't be a Christian, but proselytizing, I believe, is against the law. I'll have to double check, but I don't think you're allowed to convert people. You could preach to other Christians, but to convert a Muslim to Christianity, I think would be against the law, but I'll double check. Anyways,
Yeah, now if they know I converted and I go back to Iran, they kill me.
Okay.
Even here, yeah.
Yeah.
See, that's even in Iran, the Muslim things, you can't convert to anything else. Yeah.
Right. And I think Pakistan's similar, but I would have to before I'm dogmatic about it. Anyways, he was telling me while he had to be careful what he said, his Muslim friends would say the most horrible things about the Bible, about how it had been corrupted and how the Jews had distorted it. And he would, because he was from America and he was a trained theologian, apologist, he would try to use reason and truth, his idea of truth, right, to argue with them like why the Bible hadn't been corrupted, why it had been preserved, why Jesus was who he said he was. But they didn't care about any of his intellectual or rational arguments. And because he was so dispassionate, he was a very phlegmatic man. It was hard to ruffle him. He was very easygoing. And so the Muslims just assumed what they were saying to him was not that offensive. And as he had lived in the country more and began to understand the culture, he realized he couldn't use his intellect or truth based culture to talk to these people. He had to enter their honor shame culture to convey what he was trying to communicate. And so the next time one of them said the Bible was corrupted, he ripped his shirt open and he started pulling out his hair and started rocking and moaning. And they were like, "What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong?" And he said, "You just told me the whole book I base my life and truth on is corrupt." But see, he had to viscerally show emotion to get them to understand how offensive what they were saying was to him. And that just blew me away. And I just thought, oh, that makes so much sense. But can you imagine how hard it would be to counsel in a culture like that, or a power based culture, if you're coming from a truth based culture? Because we want to intellectualize, we want to rationalize, we want to use reason and arguments and logic. But that doesn't matter if it's an honor shame issue or a power issue. Any thoughts on
I
that?
wanted to hear where you got that Japanese proverb from. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, and I
Okay.
have no idea. It's just one of those many little
That's
tidbits.
so, it's so true. I actually used to teach English over there in Japan, and as hard as I tried to fit in, the snail got whacked. It got whacked pretty hard. Just how much I stuck out as an American. So
Oh, I can
very
imagine.
true, very true.
It's so interesting. Did they cut you any slack because they knew you were from another culture? They probably did.
I think you get a grace period
Uh-huh.
for several months, but I was there for a year, and
They
I
expected you
definitely
to,
started to feel the grace lifting
yeah,
on that
time to
stuff.
get in
So
line.
yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Joel. When I first started teaching, all my students were English as a second language South Koreans. And many of them lived up in LA and would commute down once a week to do these seminar classes I was doing. And the third weekend, it was just like one night a week for 3 hours. And the third weekend, one of the Koreans who'd been in America a little bit longer than his classmates raised his hands and he says, "No one understand anything you say." I was just like, oh, because the last 2 weeks, everyone's just sitting there like this, nodding and smiling. And I thought, oh, great. They're all like, they're not talking to me like I want, but they're at least looking at me and smiling. So it must be okay. And that's when I had a cultural aha moment. And I was like, ah, of course. Because in Korea and in a lot of Asian cultures, to question a teacher means the teacher's not doing his job correctly. In America, we don't think anything about, could you repeat that? Or could you explain that to me better? Or we're not acting like the teacher didn't do his job. It's like, we didn't get it. Could you help us get there? But for these Korean students, because of their enculturation, you didn't question the teacher. Even though I said, I want you to talk to me, I want you to engage with me, that was beyond their wildest imaginings.